Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I am joined for a second time by Sebastian Naranjo, who has just been fresh off of finishing his PhD research. And Sebastian, of course, is also formerly of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Panama. So, this is going to be a very fun conversation. Thank you again, Sebastian, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Rashid, for having invited me again. It's always a pleasure. And I'd like to remind you that the last time we spoke was in 2022, which was, several years ago. So a lot has happened since then. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of, exciting things to talk about.
Yes. So to get into that, I want to start from a more, call it academic or theoretical perspective. And we're discussing some of the research you recently finished in your thesis. And I want to start here. Very often, people frame the China, U.S., Caribbean, Central American, triangular relations as one of a not ideological competition, but often geopolitical competition. There's some ideology involved as well. But do you think that's actually a good start point to thinking about how Central American, Caribbean states regard themselves in the game, or if it is a game at all, between the U.S. and China?
I think without a doubt, there's an element of competition between China and the U.S. They, of course, compete in many aspects, in manufacturing, in technology, in many different industries. There's also an ideological, difference between each of the countries. But Central America and the Caribbean, where do they compete with China and the U.S.? They're much smaller economies. They're smaller states. They, a lot of the time, will bandwagon or align with a lot of the U.S. policies and values and this and that. And so in this order, we then have China, who commercially has been a pretty old player for many of these economies. There's been a lot of trade. Of course, we're in Panama right now. We definitely know the importance of China to the transit of the Panama Canal, also all the companies that have been established. So commercially and also culturally, there's a history there. So politically, is there a competition? I think that's a more nuanced and harder to answer question. So when we look at it from the U.S. and China perspective, one way of seeing it is how both of these great powers are, in a way, competing to become the main trading partners of these states, or the main political partners, or the main allies. But the reality is the U.S. is and has been for quite a while the main partner of Central America and the Caribbean. And to replace that, will be quite difficult. I wouldn't even go as saying it would take probably longer for these, decoupling and then to have that coupling with China. So China emerges, commercially as a partner that has been, in contact with the region for a very long time, and put it politically as a new partner that has engaged, in the late 20th century, 21st century, into political conversations with Central American and Caribbean countries. We cannot leave out the Taiwan factor, which for a very long time, up until the late 20th century, most of these states had diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Now, this trend changed as the United Nations recognized the People's Republic of China as a permanent member of the Security Council, and the U.S. also switched this diplomatic recognition. However, the other smaller states lag behind with this trend. So South America, almost all these countries established way before Central Americans and Caribbean states began to make this diplomatic switch. So I look at the period from 2004 to 2019, which encompasses Dominica, Grenada, Costa Rica, Panama, El Salvador, and Dominican Republic. Of course, if we look now, we know that Nicaragua reestablished diplomatic relations with China, because first they had diplomatic relations with China, which switched to Taiwan, and then back to China. And we also have St. Lucia, which is a very particular case because, the trend is to establish with China, I mean, People's Republic of China, whereas St. Lucia established with Taiwan. And we also have Honduras, who has developed very rapidly bilateral relations. And so I think I mention all these things to understand that when we look at relations between China and the US and Latin America, it's imperative that we make subdivisions and we differentiate between South America, Central America, and even Central America and the Caribbean. But of course, for the purposes of my research, I grouped these countries many of these countries are interchangeable. So, for example, the Dominican Republic has a lot of agreements with Central America, one of them being the DR CAFTA with the US, and also Belize, which is geographically in Central America, is actually part of CARICOM, and many argue is more culturally Caribbean.
Yeah, I would argue that also. So I want to discuss this idea of ideology because from my perspective, the question of ideology isn't a motivating factor when it comes to Central American or Caribbean states thinking about any kind of trade, economics, or even commercial, or essentially any kind of factor when it comes to foreign policy. But yet this comes up a lot, especially on the US side, when people think about Chinese politics or Central American and Caribbean politics to China. Do you think there's any role of ideology when it comes to how these states appertain themselves towards trade with China?
So, of course, all of these states will see the benefits of the China model, and we'll see how...
But which aspects of the China model? Because that's a fairly broad category of things.
Yeah, definitely. With the interviews that I've had and the experience I had working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I saw that there is a recognition of the advantages of the China model in terms, for example, of infrastructure projects, in terms of governmental bureaucracy, in terms of having a plan, something that Central American and Latin American countries as a whole lack. They don't really have 5-year plans, 10-year plans, or plans towards regions or policy papers, whereas China has all of these things. Now, appreciating this model does not mean copying this model. And this doesn't mean either, that China is trying to export this model. So the simplest argument to counter these fears of perhaps having Central American and Caribbean countries ideologically being more akin to China is China has a non-intervention policy that works both ways. It doesn't intervene in countries abroad, and it doesn't also like when other countries intervene in its local affairs. And the switches that we can point to, or not the switches, but the leftist government and communist governments that we've seen in the region were not a result of establishing or strengthening relations with China. If we point at Cuba, if we point at Nicaragua, these were movements that started in the 1950s or even before that. So ideologically, most of these countries are either center or center-right. And, well, my research does not have firm arguments towards this, but one of the arguments that I saw was how it's close to the United States. How it's, these are economies that are open to trade, that, they have some protectionist policies, but most of the time, since they're more service-oriented economies and it is in their benefit to, be of the service of ships and trade and global routes, they have fairly open and lax free trade policies, and this might be a result of simply market forces, or it might be also part of the proximity to the United States. Now, when we look at South America, we see a different spectrum. Here we see a pink tide. So we've had some governments that have been a bit to the left. We've had some governments like the one in Venezuela who has been, very socialist, and that has not led to development and has led to some pretty bad examples. And of course, when Central America elects its leaders, we see these examples. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why I think many of these states develop these pink tides, could be any number of reasons, but I see a connection between how they're more geographically distant from the U.S. and how also, when anti-American sentiment was growing in the region in the 20th century, there's a scholar, Peter Smith, that argues this was for most countries around the time of the Iraq invasion. So after 9/11, a lot of these states, they understood the intervention in Afghanistan, but the one in Iraq didn't really sit well with many of these governments, and that sort of started to distance many of these South American countries, not just commercially, but also ideologically. Mm-hmm. And what I argue in my thesis is, of course, these political fluctuations and ideological fluctuations have an incidence in the macroeconomic indicators such as trade, investment, and services, and so on.
So I want to discuss some more about why China does really care about this region. But before I do that, on the other side, it takes two to tango here. And Panama obviously is a very good case study, as you chose yourself, but also a very good case study for thinking about switching relationships. And Grenada is also a very good one that I know a fair amount about on the strictly pure Caribbean side. So there is obviously the idea that there's a paper by Tom Long and I forgot the co-author's name. I think he's from Chile or Peru. And they calculated there was a substantial benefit on a macroeconomic level of opportunity costs. If countries remain to be Taiwan allies, they essentially have a hit in terms of growth as compared to Chinese allies. And, they factor in different investments and trade potential, free trade deals, and so on. So there is a material benefit of switching to China, even if no one actively pursues that policy. And therefore, at the same time, there's also a strategic deficit for economies remaining to be a Taiwan ally. So what is then the basis, in your view, of countries formally making the choice to switch allies? But then in this question, to me, is more interesting, given I said that it's a Taiwan cost and not a Taiwan benefit. Why then will you switch back? Like, for example, St. Lucia.
Okay. So I would contest this economic impact that states after switching diplomatic relations have, because if we read carefully the MOUs of the establishment of diplomatic relations with China, there is a very specific mention of official ties. So there can't be any official ties with Taiwan, but there really is no mention of commercial ties. So trade can continue and commerce can continue to flow. So perhaps these hits in the macroeconomic investments or trade or services might also be influenced by other variables. It's possible that, for example, I've seen some examples where after the establishment of diplomatic relations with China, you have trade interrupted by things like the pandemic, or you have trade interrupted by, for example, when a company, which we can talk about this case of Costa Rica, who signed a free trade agreement with China and had a trade surplus because Intel was manufacturing computer components and selling them to China. So trade surplus was great and everything was going well until Intel moved its operations to Vietnam. So that's perhaps something that might happen with Taiwan, although I would have to go into the specifics. My point here is, establishing diplomatic relations with China does not mean Taiwan disappears entirely. Taiwan disappears at an official, political, and diplomatic level. So states need to be very careful with how they manage this because.
But you say that, and that could be true. But for example, let's say in the case of Grenada, when Grenada switched to PRC formally, politically formally, after the Hurricane Ivan disaster more presently, they had substantial loans from Taiwan Development Bank, and the Taiwan Development Bank, after the switch happened to PRC, they essentially pushed Grenada to repay the loans, and the Grenada took to court, and it was a 10-year battle. Eventually, they refused to sign the debt restructuring contract with Grenada, and again, 10 years down the line, they eventually relented. But they haven't actually had any increased economic activity with Taiwan since then. Panama is a very rare case because Panama is so central to so many things. But what examples would you use to say that countries, even after the formal change, in small countries, actually still retain some kind of economic, commercial relationship, even near to the same level that they would have had prior to the change?
Yeah. So, of course, El Salvador is a good case of this because El Salvador also, prior to the cut in diplomatic ties, had a free trade agreement with Taiwan. Like, Taiwan had a free trade agreement, or has a free trade agreement with almost all of the Central American countries because, of course, as a way of, retaining them, there was a lot of trade flows. And what El Salvador had to do in order to save its sugar industry was, in a way, put a stop to the cancellation of the free trade agreement with Taiwan. Because if El Salvador wanted to commence negotiations with China, it had to put a stop. So for a time up until, and I would have to look at the trade flows. Trade between El Salvador and Taiwan continued and remained for the main industries and main products. Now, will this change once China has a free trade agreement with El Salvador? It's very possible. Or, if El Salvador is able to leverage both, that would be quite an ideal scenario.
Sure.
After all, we have to remember that Taiwan and China, in economic terms, are economies. So they're both part of the World Trade Organization and considered economies. And China considers Taiwan as part of its territory. So, I'm speaking here, which I don't want to do, but thinking from the Chinese point of view, wouldn't it be negative to impact Taiwan's trade with other countries considering it's part of its own territory? Going back to why is the motivation to establish diplomatic relations? So I identified three key aspects. The first one is, states want to, at least Central American and Caribbean states, they want to be more global, they want to be more international, they want to be, at a discussion level with China, at a, Security Council member and member of many other organizations. And so there are several stops that China will put if you don't have diplomatic relations. They might be in the same area, but to talk at a governmental level, that has become in a way a limitation. The second one is, of course, to diversify. So, with some countries, depending on what their customs and their sanitary conditions are, they can basically export and import almost freely. But with China, there are certain protocols that need to be signed at a governmental level. So they're usually signed between the customs unions of each of the countries and the Ministry of Agriculture. And although these, Central American and Caribbean countries are mostly service, they also have an agricultural industry that employs a large part of their population, and they have certain products that they, of course, want to develop. And when they see China, they see a very big market, very big opportunities. So a lot of the time, exporters from these countries will support the change in diplomatic relations, unless you have the case of Paraguay that has a meat industry that is heavily reliant on the Taiwanese market, and the uncertainty of not knowing whether China will be able to absorb this meat, volumes and flows, of course, is also an argument for maintaining the status quo as it is. The other reason is sort of economic, can be economic, but is mostly international cooperation. So once diplomatic relations are established, China can then offer concessional loans, non-concessional loans, and other forms of international cooperation. These exist, of course, as well without diplomatic relations. So, for example, before diplomatic relations, Panama would have scholarships, anything between 5 and 10 every year, and they would increase the number of scholarships for Panamanian students. Of course, after diplomatic relations, you not only have scholarships, you have donations, you have financing mechanisms that have resulted in economic, have had an economic impact. So, for example, the library of El Salvador part of it was financed using these cooperation funds, and this has a economic impact. Partly, not fully.
Have you been to that library, by the way?
No, unfortunately, I haven't.
So I went there last year, and it's very funny because you walk up to it and you realize this is literally what a library in China looks like. Like if you go to a proper tier 3 city library, it's literally the exact same infrastructure. It's planted in San Salvador. It's very strange.
No, and that also reminds me that the Amador Convention Center looks just like a Chinese convention center.
That's right.
Like when I saw it, I saw a Chinese convention center, and of course, many people who haven't been to China or haven't seen what China's infrastructure projects are like would have probably just saw the modern design and really liked it. But to me, it was just very similar to a Chinese railway station or a convention center or these sorts of new architectural projects that are happening. Yeah.
I find that very fun. There's one thing you mentioned, and people mention it all the time, and I have an objection to it. So people use lots of trade data when they're talking about China, the U.S., the Caribbean, or any country, but obviously we're talking about Latin America here and the Caribbean. So this idea of trade surplus or trade deficit and so on. Here's my contention. If you live in the Caribbean or Latin America or Central America, anywhere essentially in the Americas or most of the world, to be honest, and you go to a store and you see a washing machine or a fridge, anything you buy, it would say made in China. Everything says made in China. But if you go look at the official trade accounting, the data would suggest that, okay, maybe a lot of U.S. trade, maybe a lot of European trade, but yeah, everything comes from China. So there's some people in macroeconomics and trade economics call it phantom trade, where technically the trade is with China, the origin factory and sellers, but because of the intermediaries, it would not appear as the accounting for Chinese trade. So in Barbados, for example, where I'm from, you would have most of your buying done in Miami, some in Panama, but mostly in Miami and New York. Because that'll be some U.S. trade data, kind of the direct source. But anyone knows it's actually just Chinese goods. So there's some economists in the Caribbean, for example, like Delao Warrell, who's the former governor of the Central Bank of Barbados. He would argue that the actual benefit of China to the Caribbean, or Central America in this case, isn't in any kind of formal relationship. It's not any loan, any concessionary grant. It's simply the existence of Chinese factories offering cheaper goods, because the cost savings that the Caribbean countries would get by actually having cheaper production done in China, that could be reallocated to other sources at a much larger margin than any loan could ever give them. And people don't tend to bring this up when thinking about China. So St. Lucia or St. Vincent that still have Taiwan relations with China get the exact same benefit as Barbados or Jamaica because they have access to the same cheaper goods. If you go to a store in St. Vincent, you see it made in China. So from that, kind of more, I don't want to call it meta trade level, but on that level, it really doesn't seem to me there's really any core benefit of keeping formal relations with Taiwan, or on the flip side, there is no real benefit either of getting formal relationships with PRC. So I'm still at a loss why some leaders choose to do it. There is one story, or one version of the story, where people say, well, it all comes down to the person in charge. So in Paraguay, for example, the leadership there isn't particularly, call it, super democratic. They decide what they want to do, and for historical reasons, they've been showered by gifts by Taiwan, or there are things like that, so they prefer Taiwan. In St. Lucia or St. Vincent, for example, the prime minister there has been in charge for 21 years, and he's a big fan of Taiwan. For some reason, we're not sure why, because it's not ideological. So the U.S. would say, we thank our partnerships in St. Vincent for upholding democratic values in the world by being a Taiwan ally. At the same time, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent has his autobiography called The Comrade. He's a big supporter of Fidel Castro. He's a big supporter of Maduro also, even trying to say Maduro won the last election. And he's, famous or infamous in the Caribbean for saying all roads lead to me in St. Vincent. So I wouldn't really call him a very big democratic ally personally, but the U.S. does. So in all that considered, it's still, to me, very unclear structurally, kind of systematic way how people can come to a conclusion, one or the other, that a state decides for some particular material way to choose one or the other.
Yeah, definitely. It's more nuanced and unclear. A lot of the time, these diplomatic relations are discussed, secretly by the leaders, and there's got to be a mutual interest between both states to establish diplomatic relations, and we only really find out once the memorandum of understanding has already been signed. And once the Taiwanese embassy or the Taiwanese mission has been notified that they are no longer recognized and that they basically have to leave. Now, going back to the first point you made about, yes, China-made products versus assembled in a third country and then re-exported. I think that has to do with the laws of origin and how each country applies these laws of origin. So one of the ways that Panama has tried to take advantage of its position and connectivity and logistics is through legislation that encourages manufacturing companies to establish their manufacturing operations in Panama, and then from there, export. Now, my question is, at the moment, I haven't seen any examples of this, but, I'm thinking, if I'm a China, a producer of commercial goods or manufactured goods, and I have a tariff on my product if I export directly to the US, what if I set up a little assembly plant in Panama, export the separate materials, assemble them in Panama, and export them as Panama origin without tariffs? Is it worth it? Is that cheaper than of paying the additional tariffs? And is this a Panamanian product or is this a Chinese product? Or exporting the fully manufactured product to Panama, nationalizing it, and then re-exporting it, which is actually, when we look at the trade figures of Panama, there's a distinction between what is imported and what is imported and re-exported. Because of course, we know the Cologne Free Zone is a place where many companies have warehouses, and they'll kind of do this trick to save time and save things. Now, going back to how, with the argument, which I think is a pretty valid argument of, the real benefit is lowering costs, I think that goes back to what is the priority of these countries. So is that their priority? Like, is that what they're looking for when they establish diplomatic relations? So from the side of the countries that I saw, you have a bit of both. So you have some very pragmatic ones, like the St. Lucia one. I was in St. Lucia a few weeks ago, and I really loved how you connect to the Wi-Fi, and it's a partnership between Taiwan and St. Lucia. And basically, they had a cricket stadium that needed renovation, and China was not, I guess, offering the funds, and Taiwan said they would offer the funds in exchange for diplomatic relations. And the stadium was built, and the Cricket World Cup was held there. So it was a kind of a controversial construction. Now, for other countries like Panama and the Dominican Republic, we don't really see this transactional, a tangible benefit. So, yeah, with Panama, we saw a plethora of memorandums of understandings and agreements that were signed, including a lot of export protocols. But then the export protocols don't mean an increase in trade flows immediately. It means that, exporters can then basically apply to become registered exporters for China. And then even after that, they have to go and approach clients and negotiate prices, and of course negotiate volumes that are very, very different to what the rest of the region exports. If you're looking at shrimp, it's very hard for a country like Honduras or Panama to compete with the volumes of Ecuador. So, of course, perhaps from our point of view, we know the distinction. But when I visited the China export fair, I went 2 years. Many of the Chinese buyers wanted to buy from the prices of Ecuador, and of course, because of the volumes, it was a much lower cost. So that was one of the challenges that were there, and because of these changes in the individual and the decision making, I incorporate a foreign policy analysis into my thesis to sort of factor in how even though states are agents that are rigid in a certain way, there is some maneuverability. And foreign policy analysis helps us explain this top down and bottom up relationship that individual leaders will take.
So I am generally very skeptical on this kind of analysis, especially when it comes to very, very small states. So, when you speak to leaders of, again, very small states like the Caribbean states, they don't have any real reasoning behind things they do. Very often, the reason is simple as expedience. It's just something easy to do. In the case of St. Lucia, for example, many political scholars in St. Lucia are, of course, the Caribbean still, but to focus on St. Lucia, they don't get why St. Lucian government would remain to be a formal Taiwan ally. There's no economic reason. Truthfully, there is no strong geopolitical reason, obviously. There is no really engaging kind of like U.S.-centric policy because Barbados has substantially better U.S. policy than St. Lucia, and Barbados is a PRC ally. They don't get why, in an academic perspective, the St. Lucia government would want to remain a Taiwan ally. The only conclusion is the person in charge likes Taiwan. So how realistic is it to have this kind of perspective when you have such personalistic policy, especially in very small states?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It could just be a matter of impulse. So I remember when Panama established diplomatic relations with China, the arguments that the president and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was putting out were already things that were happening. So it was like, oh yeah, because we have all of these Chinese, diaspora, we have this influence, but it was like, right, but we had, well, not influence, like presence. And we already had all of this without diplomatic relations.
Right.
It's not like because we established diplomatic relations, there's going to be more of it or less of it. And in terms of trade, it was the same. China was one of the main users of the Panama Canal.
Right.
Still is. Still is. And when we looked at, Chinese investments, there were Chinese investments, both private, both public, before diplomatic relations. There were a lot of multinational companies China-based companies that had their regional headquarters in Panama. And of course, this is an investment. It also employs some local staff, also some Chinese staff, So I agree with you. It's not as clear why these states will do it. I have heard from the various interviews that I've done that it was basically an opportunity that opened that was not opened, previously because, from 2008, 2019, 2016, there was a diplomatic truce between Taiwan and China.
Mm-hmm.
And Panama had manifested on several occasions the interest in establishing diplomatic relations. And China had simply not rejected, not accepted it, but the real steps hadn't taken place until the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, won in Taiwan, and the posture of pro-independence was a way where this opening happened. And after Panama, you then had the Dominican Republic, then you had El Salvador. I'm not sure if that was in that order, but it was the same year. It was in 2018, and most recently we've had Nicaragua and Honduras. And well, we'll have to wait and see, what the trend is. Perhaps these other trends, these other switches haven't happened because there hasn't been a change in government that has been open to this. Mm-hmm. So, say Guatemala, there were elections recently in the past few years, and there was some discussion that this would happen. Honduras, that reminds me, when Xiomara Castro, was speaking publicly about it, she reinforced the support to Taiwan, mm-hmm. and then some time later she made the switch.
That's right.
So yeah, can we take these states seriously? Definitely, there's a degree of uncertainty that is difficult to predict, mm-hmm. and that is difficult to measure. I think one way of looking at it is maybe not what they'll gain, but what will they lose. Mm-hmm. Now, with the Taipei Act of 2019 of the U.S. and the Trump government that is more hostile towards China, well, basically hostile towards everyone, but particularly China. Now it might be more costly, mm-hmm. for states to switch diplomatic recognition, knowing that they might have a reaction from the U.S. Mm-hmm. And well, if we look at Guatemala, and if we look at Belize, and we look at St. Lucia, they have quite a strong relationship with the U.S. Mm-hmm. So is leaving Taiwan for China, not really understanding what the concrete benefits will be, mm-hmm. worth establishing diplomatic relations with China?
Yeah. See, that's the, I guess, tricky part, because obviously I believe there is no actual benefit for a small state to change to PRC. At the same time, there's no actual benefit of also staying with Taiwan also. So it really comes down to some larger geopolitical perspective, which again, I don't think most Caribbean leaders or Central American leaders care about. Maybe they might have some impulse, but they don't really care about these kind of things. That's my view. I have a theory, I don't think it's controversial, but people consider it controversial. I don't think Taiwan will have any allies in 5 years. Maybe they might keep the Vatican, but I mean, I don't count that in any serious way. And that kind of makes the question, and nothing will change with Taiwan if Taiwan has zero formal allies in 5 years, because it still has real allies, like, for example, Taiwan passport still goes to the U.S., it's still a larger economy than Australia. It still has the most important company on earth right now, TSMC. So in reality, nothing really changes if Taiwan has no allies. And why should these small, and they're all small countries, why should these small countries remain to be an ally of Taiwan besides simply the leaders like going to Taiwan for a parade? At this point, that's all they have. I don't know if you have a view on that. Do you think it's actually relevant to Taiwan to really maintain these, on paper, allies? Because again, they can't really help Taiwan in any realistic way besides having paper partnerships.
Yeah, there is a term in the literature that I went through called Taiwan's international living space. Mm. So it essentially just means the international states that still recognize Taiwan as a state. And this international living space is shrinking. The trend is not for states, well, with the exceptions that we've mentioned, to establish diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but instead with China. And, this, I guess, it has several implications.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, what is a state? I think we have to understand that, under the Montevideo Convention of what a state is, international recognition is an essential, part of the definition. So you need like a permanent government, permanent population, defined territory, and international recognition. So, of course, from this point of view, Taiwan is a state, but only to some states. Hence, is it something absolute or is it something that's relative?
Mm-hmm.
That would be something that of course, will change if states continue with this trend.
Mm-hmm.
The other aspect that is pretty relevant is China has become more assertive with its intention to reclaim Taiwan or have it part of its territory, and it set a date.
Mm-hmm.
So when this date arrives, we're going to something's going to happen. Like, for sure, the status quo is not going to remain. And before this date, something preventive could happen. So when we look at when we look at Macau and Hong Kong, under the one China, two systems, one country, two systems model, many people don't know that this was actually a model that was initially designed for Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, this did not go as planned, or I guess as planned from the Chinese point of view, from a PRC point of view, and was adopted for Macau and Hong Kong. Now, I think something similar could have happened had there'd be a general consensus that the system works.
Mm-hmm.
However, we can't ignore the protests that took place in Hong Kong and the, outflow of Hong Kongese nationals to the rest of the world. I mean, clearly there's a discontent there. And now with the Hong Kong security law, this has even become more of a example of perhaps something that Taiwan does not want.
Yeah, I think hopefully should be clear to people that a Hong Kong style Taiwan is a substantially worse Taiwan. I hope that's not too controversial to tell people this right now, but that is not a good option. And that kind of really brings up, it's a bit of a broader question outside of the scope of your specific research, but the idea that why do we even care about what happens to Taiwan? Obviously, it's an implicit element of this, any kind of conversation when it comes to China foreign policy in the world. And usually people try to not play this card, but okay, they will say, oh, because TSMC, that's why we care. That's why we care about Taiwan. But I guess from my perspective, you can't really have a well-functioning, economically relevant, democratic, open, liberal society and then have it squashed by a communist party and be kind of, let's just go about our business type thing. That is not the kind of trend anyone wants to have in the world. Of course, that brings up larger questions about, well, should we kind of fight for it and so on and so on. But generally speaking, people don't realize how difficult the situation has changed in Hong Kong and how really difficult it would be in Taiwan as well if PRC were to have control of Taiwan. And that's why I think people kind of brush it aside and, okay, well, it's over there, it's far apart, they're Chinese people, it's not really my problem. But it should really be any person who seriously thinks about these things like foreign policy and liberal trade and liberalism and, all these kind of Western values that we at least I hope we have. So, do you actually find it relevant that this when you have, when you think about politics or political science here in the Central America, do people actually really think about the deep implications of having Taiwan squashed by the PRC? Of course, that's probably a harsh term, but that's why I think it will happen. Or to just see it as these very basic academic, crude, examples of what expanding powers or geopolitical platforms would do?
So what you said reminded me a lot about the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is very, very far away. But, we see one country, Ukraine, who's existentially fighting for its survival. And you have another bigger country, Russia, that it claims it's just the same country. So, of course, the U.S., has these two oceans on the sides, cares because of the international order. But then you have Europe, and seeing Russia advance is, cares more about it. And, I'm an international relations scholar. So I care and I believe in these institutions that we created after the Second World War. Before that, I even, see the benefits in the failed League of Nations in preventing these sorts of conflicts, like the Second World War, like all these conflicts that were basically the destruction of humanity from happening. Now, we may see Taiwan as something very distant, but there is something that we need to focus on, which is the self-determination of people, and the world order and its institutions. So if you have a state like Ukraine that is fighting for its independence, and you have a state like Taiwan that is fighting for its independence, I think just crossing our hands and letting the bigger state, absorb this other one, is forgetting a lot of the history that happened in the 20th century. And in a way, externalizing. If, for example, I hear in the news that someone got robbed, I'm probably not going to be very concerned. But then if my neighbor gets robbed, I think I'm going to be very concerned. So I kind of see it, I see it in those terms. And, I would accept it more and understand it more if China and Taiwan got to some sort of agreement. Of course, using certain instruments and using certain structures that we as a society throughout all these years built. Otherwise, it's just going to be a all against all hard power relationship in the world, which in the end that's not the way that the world order has been shaping itself. So it'd be going back.
I want to ask about the canal because this is now like the topic du jour when it comes to China, Latin America, Panama, and U.S. politics and different controversies. So Trump has said somewhat, maybe unfairly, depending on your perspective, that China controls the Panama Canal in some way. And secondly, that the U.S. is being unfairly treated in the cost when it comes to using the canal, that in his viewpoint, it's not unwarranted that the U.S. controlled the canal for a longer time than Panama. He said it was a very bad deal that the U.S. actually handed the canal over to Panama. So this whole geopolitical revision he wants to do also. But at the same time, the U.S. does contribute the vast majority of income to the canal, and therefore to a big chunk of Panama. So about 9% of Panamanian government revenue comes from income of the Panama Canal. And the majority of income in the Panama Canal comes from tolls it charges the cargo ships to go through the canal. And about 60% of that comes from the U.S. origin cargo. So it's a substantial proportion when it comes to China, relative to China. And at the same time, Hong Kong companies, up until recently, control the operations of the port, the different ports on the canal sites. So, I'm wondering, from your perspective, international foreign policy scholar, but also Panamanian, to what extent is this question now relevant again, and where is it, if ever, that Trump has somewhat justification for thinking about there is a risk of China in Panama as it pertains to the canal?
Okay, so my reading of the comments of Trump, I wouldn't say the Trump administration because, Trump says one thing, then Marco Rubio says something else, etc., is that he's not comfortable with the status quo. So something needs to change. And that's fine. But things cannot change if if he dismisses previous agreements and things that have happened in the past that have been signed by previous U.S. presidents and and gone through a series of negotiations. Otherwise, he can just, erase everything the U.S. has ever done and just rewrite all the U.S., all the Constitution, all these things, which he's not going to do. So he needs to be consistent with these things and respect what has happened in the past. Now, when he makes these statements of how it was a bad deal for the U.S., well, he can negotiate a new deal, with Panama. Like Panama also negotiated the 1904 deal for the construction in 1977, 1970s. However, we can't think of the Panama Canal as the same canal that was finished in 1914 because the Panama Canal has expanded. And the U.S. is the main user of the Panama Canal. And most of the revenue from this goes through the expanded canal, which Panama paid. So, yes, it's coming from, U.S. shipping, but it's not a donation. It's not just, it's a paying for a service. It's paying for a cost. And also, when Trump says that the U.S. paid for the canal, he is omitting, and I'm not sure how to calculate this, the cost of the resources that were necessary to run the canal. So the water that is used for the canal, which is the most important asset, is Panamanian. The land is also Panamanian. And, many other aspects of it are not, it's not like he can't just take the canal and move it somewhere else. He's got to take into account the cost of the land and the cost of the resources to run it. Now, a few years ago, or if I'm not mistaken, in 2024, we saw how vulnerable the canal was to climate change. And part of making the canal continue to work requires infrastructure projects, additional infrastructure projects, for this waterway to be a functional. And if he goes back to the limits of the canal zone, all of these waterways initiated outside of the canal zone. So, right, let's say hypothetically Trump takes over the canal, because there is no question that he has, and the U.S. government has the military power to do so. Couldn't Panama, in its own territory, block these waterways and have the canal not function without this water, for example? This is not something that I'm coming up with. During the Torrijos-Carter negotiation treaties in 1970s, this is a consideration that, yes, the U.S. Built the engineering and brought the labor and all this and all that, but the main, say, resource that powers the canal is in Panamanian sovereign territory. So going to the Hong Kong ports, when we look at the history of these Hong Kongese ports, they were initially granted the concession when Hong Kong was part of the UK, and most of the shareholders of this company were British. So yes, nowadays with the Hong Kong security law, Hong Kong being part of China, technically, in a way, information could be shared. But first off, what information does this company have? Like port information, shipping information? I would say I wouldn't be concerned about the sort of information that they have. I would be more concerned about, for example, technology companies. China-based technology company. I'm not saying there's, a risk here. I'm just saying if the China risk is the concern, why target this port? Why not target all of the companies, or why not target the one that presents the highest risk? Well, now we know that, I guess out of pressure from the U.S., out of the investigation from the audit from the comptroller's office, the assets of Panama Ports Company, which were, the parent company was this Hong Kongese HK Holdings. I think HK Holdings got a pretty sweet deal. They got both ports sold for over $20 billion, which they're going to be reinvesting somewhere else.
That's right.
And BlackRock, that has many assets, got a strategic, two strategic ports. But even then, Trump continues to point at the Chinese influence of the canal. And I would argue that, the fact that this Hong Kongese company had the concession of these two ports does not qualify as China influence. And now this is already a factor that is not even in the picture. So where is the China influence? I think my reading is Trump is using this as a negotiating tactic to get Panama to concede, to have concessions. So, when I saw Marco Rubio's visit to Panama and I saw the results of this, I was in a way surprised that Panama accepted the migrants in the U.S., irregular migrants that had complicated legal statuses to receive them under the condition that the U.S. would pay for all this operation. But I thought, wasn't this visit about Chinese influence? Like, why is one of the results this migration thing? So maybe the real issue was migration, and the Chinese influence was just a negotiating tactic to get Panama to concede. The other result was the Belt and Road Initiative, which this goes back to how in my thesis I speak about self-balancing, because in a spectrum of possibilities, you could have the U.S. pressuring Panama to cut diplomatic relations with China, or to say, look, you're going to expel all Chinese companies from Panama. And then Panama saying, no, I can't do that. Like, I'm not going to do that. And then but then the U.S. saying, right, so don't renew the Belt and Road Initiative MOU. And Panama saying, oof, that was a good save. I won't do that. However, this calls into question what the sovereignty of Panama is and how it's influenced by the U.S. Because, we can argue back and forth with any number of scholars of what does Panama gain about being part of the Belt and Road. It's actually a framework agreement. So inside the framework, it was expected to have programs and to have projects, but these really didn't materialize. However, it was Panama's choice to sign to the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's Panama's choice to not renew the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, seen as it came right after the state visit, it's very easy to see this link with how this was part of pressure by the U.S. Now, what is going to happen? I think that since Panama conceded, and Trump saw that Panama conceded, Panama will concede again. We'll have to wait for the next thing that the U.S. requests. Now, that going back to the Hutchinson ports, if Panama has these Hong Kongese ports, and if Panama renewed the concession automatically, that is Panama's choice and Panama's decision. Who is the U.S. to say that wasn't transparent or that they got a sweet deal? It's up to Panama to decide to renew it or not. Now, if there is an internal investigation and they find that there is a breach of contract and there is another company that will offer a better deal, that's Panama leveraging its strategic assets and how it manages them. However, since it came as a result of these pressures, of this visit, that really calls into question, number one, the sovereignty of Panama over its assets and how they can be so easily influenced by baseless accusations. And in an international relations perspective in the world order, that just represents the limited agency of developing states and, with these, big power politics.
But at the same time, I am a very strident realist when it comes to foreign policy. And, there's this phrase that I think is always relevant from Kaplan, the jungle grows back. The jungle always grows back. Small states they only have relevant sovereignty to the extent that larger, more powerful states allow it to have it. Now, this is not a very nice statement. It is not a very fun thing for people to realize, but this is how it is. The jungle grows back in the sense that, the U.S. for a long time has just decided not to push anyone around. you probably frame it as, well, the U.S. has not exercised its geopolitical force for its own strategic interests. Okay, as for example, another phrase that I like that was from Condoleezza Rice when she said the U.S. has values, but it also has interests, and they're often not the same thing. So when it comes to people talking about Panama sovereignty, I get that. There's lots of international law behind that and so on, but that is only to the extent that people need to remember that in international policy, the anarchy is state of play. No one can really hold larger powers to that much account when they want to get something done, especially against much smaller states. Of course, on the margin, you have the ICC, you have the different UN sanctions. Sure, all these things are all marginal. But what we see here comes to Panama with Trump at play, or at the hand of the game now, is that you realize that, yes, the normal state of realist anarchy overtakes any kind of maybe it's necessary, but at the same time, fictions when it comes to international foreign policy. And I do want to add something before we go on. Call it a little pushback when it comes to these things. So I realize a lot of Panamanians talk about how, yes, Panama have expanded the canal, but they didn't. They expanded the locks of the canal. The actual canal, the main thing, is still the thing that the US built. That hasn't actually changed much over the last century. The locks were adjusted. And even one of the biggest problems with the canal right now that was exacerbated by the El Nino phenomenon last year with the drought of the water is that if the canal had expanded reservoir for actually allowing more water to store up to then for use in the canal in a drought period, you wouldn't have the drought period affecting the canal route that much. And this was a conversation that the Canal Authority, or essentially before the Canal Authority, it was a conversation that was in the works prior to handover, and still to this day hasn't been done because of different political posturing by the Panamanian government of not actually wanting to transfer the land, not wanting to actually disturb the peace, not wanting to do the actual work that would be required to have a properly functioning canal, even given the climate change issue. So I always say there is no climate change issue, it's a technological issue and the infrastructure issue that people blame on climate change, because if you blame on bad fiscal policy or bad governmental management. Because it is Panama's own canal now, it's Panama's fault, therefore, that there is no extra reservoir. So all these things in consideration, it is somewhat more difficult then to say that, well, there is no extra benefit of the U.S. reclaiming control over the canal. One last thing, and when you speak to, for example, some persons who work in the canal, they might say this, well, the U.S. people, compared to Chinese people, will actually integrate a lot better with service providers and just culture and stuff in Panama on the canal zone relative to the different international Chinese workers that will come from Hutchinson and so on. So you even have more potential integration and outsourcing of the infrastructure requirements if it was much more U.S. control. It really kind of forces us to ask the question, is it more beneficial for the world if Panama didn't control the canal as much as it did, because we would actually have probably a faster canal route?
Okay, so going back to the realist interaction of small states in the world order, yeah, like big states, they set the parameters, and then small states have to navigate it. Mm-hmm. So with Panama and the U.S., there is a redefinement of what the parameters are. So, for example, before, in 2017, when Panama established diplomatic relations, to 2019, Chinese companies could build, I wouldn't even call these investments. They were subcontracted by the government as a result of winning public bids of convention centers, of cruise terminals, of the fourth bridge over the canal, and it was fine. Actually, the main issues of these infrastructure projects were not necessarily, they were mostly internal. So it was mostly just, these unions and workers syndicates that wanted to work, but then there were too many Chinese workers, and this wasn't really an issue. But then now everything is dual use. Everything. Oh, this bridge could be used as a monitoring
Right.
for all the ships that pass. It goes borderline ridiculous.
Yeah.
So there's a redefinition of what the parameters are. One of the reasons for that is, which is why I use a dual framework of my thesis, because I have structural realism that builds the structure, and then you have foreign policy analysis that explains the navigations, or at least helps to understand the navigations of states inside this framework. Now, back to the argument of what the expansion of the canal, is. I think, yeah, there are, we can continue arguing about, who dug out the land and who made the Gatun Lake back in the day in the Rio Chares and the reservoir and this and that. And of course, we can go back to all of this and argue back and forth. But I think what is harder to argue is that there were treaties negotiated by both states in the previous century. And there was a handover, and the canal, with the exception of, I would say, external forces such as climate change, has functioned and has responded well, and has had a flow of ships. And there are, of course, arguments now that the shipping, the cost of transit has gotten higher and it's too expensive. But these are things that can be negotiated. I mean, I don't think that, if, for example, there was a clear incompetence and negligence by the Panama Canal Authority in administering the canal, I would argue, or I would be more in favor of, maybe we should concede that too, like put that to a concession. But there are really no indicators to suggest that it hasn't been smooth. Now, I agree. The reservoir was something that, before the Canal Authority, before the limits of the Canal Authority were defined and how this would interfere with the communities of Rio Indio, that was quite frustrating, because on the one hand there was a population of 2,000 people, which is not little, but it's an international waterway, and well, thankfully this was this is going in the direction to build the additional reservoir that will guarantee the supply of water, in times of drought or not. Now, this reminds me a lot of the hearing that happened in the commission, of the U.S. Senate Commission, where you had Luis Sola as a special guest, and how there was like a discourse vacuum, because there were no Panamanian representatives.
Yes, that's true.
And the excuse of the sub-administrator of the canal was, well, we were notified only, 2 days in advance or a few days in advance. But she should have gone anyways.
Yes.
And I think that was a mistake that Panama made. Because, of course, Luis Sola, who has, a family business, I speculate, because, of course, you can't have two situations at the same time, but I speculate that, right, because there is a Chinese presence, possibly some Chinese business that could be developed, and he also has this marina that he's constructing, he's, of course, going to be against not just the Chinese, but just any other competition, because it's not in his interest.
That's right.
And I noticed in many of the statements that he made that he made some wrong statements that I think, had a Panamanian been there, would have corrected. So, for example, when he said that the Chinese embassy that was going to be that was the idea to build it in the Amador was going to be where his concession is,
right.
That's wrong, because the idea of building in Amador was like kilometers away, where there's some lands that are, there's the Omar Torrijos mausoleum there, there's a few statues, which, it's, you see the canal, but it's not where he claimed it was. So, when I caught on that lie, I understood that he could have been lying or saying things that were inaccurate. So this, of course, feeds into these arguments that are very dangerous because it seems to me like decisions, very important decisions, are being made on misinformation, which is not being cross-checked or verified. And no, it's quite worrying.
So I guess we can move to the last question, but I guess that we could frame Trump's view on the Panama Canal as this. It's something that John Maynard Keynes said a long time ago, where if you know that the conclusion is going to be moderation and compromise, then it's more prudent to start from an extreme position. So you start at the most extreme place you can get, so hopefully when you come down to the moderation, you can edge it toward your favor. That could be his position on all these things, of course. Now, I want to move on to our final point. A final question from me, actually, is when I find, as I guess maybe you also, but I won't put words in your mouth, that when we have conversations in Latin America and the Caribbean, especially Central America and the Caribbean, about China and the U.S., there is no very, let's say, nuanced perspective that people in policy areas tend to have. Like, if you were to tell people who work in policy, specifically foreign ministries in Latin America, what should they think about? What's like a key takeaway they should frame themselves when they approach the idea of thinking about China in their region, the U.S. versus China in their region? How would you go about saying to them, hey guys, listen up?
So any country that engages bilaterally with Panama has to be understood in terms of what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the advantages. Now, the fact that China has demonstrated an interest does not mean that China should be scrutinized differently. States through their foreign policy, the directorates, and Panama has this in a way this method of dealing with proposals and dealing with this and that, need to know what is beneficial for the country and what isn't. And they need to understand what the cost of making a decision or the benefit of making a decision is. Now, it seems like the last government of Panama and the current government of Panama now, because initially it was more of a pragmatic approach, have been very wary of any engagement with China, or at least any profound engagement with China. But China's not all bad. Of course, China is a big power, is a state that has developed many industries, and is of course another state to analyze and consider. But China also has some common ground with Panama. It's also a developing country, or it says it's a developing country. And if you go to China and you go to Shanghai and Beijing, you might say, this is not a developing country. But then you go to smaller cities, second, third tier cities, and you understand that China also has a lot of issues like Panama does. So, this is just one common ground. The other thing is, many industries have developed very, very well. And I have a very good example that Panama should not exclude. So the Metro Line 3 of Panama is a great project. I mean, I really like this project because it represents how how clever Panama can be with its close allies or close countries. So it's financed by Japan International Cooperation Agency. It's the largest financing that JICA has in the region. Really, really good interest rates. And it was concessioned to a Korean consortium, HPH Venture. And, it's advancing very well. There's a lot of know-how, a lot of technical knowledge. But because of the skepticism and the change in attitude of the previous government, it was separated from the fourth bridge. So initially, Line 3 would cross the fourth bridge. I mean, that would have been spectacular. because the fourth bridge crosses the canal. So you can imagine a train crossing over the canal, and they separated it so that the train, the metro, would go under the canal, like underwater. And of course, this implied an additional cost and additional planning and etc. Now, this was a way of separating, from the government's point of view, Ministry of Public Works, separating a Chinese project from a non-Chinese project. We can look at it that way, because the fourth bridge over the canal is made out of a consortium of two Chinese companies, Czech and CCCCC. But when HPH Venture, the Korean consortium, started to do the studies to build this tunnel under the canal, they realized that they couldn't do it, that they had to subcontract another company to do this.
Okay.
And guess the country where this company is from?
China.
So they're good at building tunnels. The conclusion could be, China's good at building tunnels, but not just about building tunnels. And this was, this is such a great example, because there was no intervention from the government. This was purely a private company decision as to who can dig this tunnel better and, I guess, cheaper. And it was a Chinese company. So to policymakers, I tell them, look, we need to have the wisdom to decide, with which countries to engage with what, and not to exclude, based on perhaps prejudice or misinformation or not enough research, but to really make evidence-based and research-based decisions.
Sebastian, thank you so much for joining me once again on the podcast. This has been a very insightful conversation.
Thank you very much for having me again, Rashid, and I don't exclude the possibility of being on your show again.